We've been talking about how to extract data and manipulate it around, but what I want to focus on in this particular section is our ability within this environment of robotics process automation to utilize the local and accessible files as well as the local memory. Now, by local memory, we typically refer to that as the clipboard. When we do a copy, where does that information reside? What can we do with it? How can we manipulate it? How can we access the values that are there? So that is our clipboard and file management set of activities. Let's take a little bit of time to look at what that clipboard really means and what we can actually accomplish with it. Now, the clipboard itself is temporary storage. It's definitely limited, but its limitations are large enough for most purposes. I mean, anyone who's tried to copy the entirety of a very long Word document or a very large detailed picture understands how much memory we have. Now, in reality, we're limited by the physics and the architecture. How much RAM do you have available? How much of that is accessible to a single activity? How much of it is actually paged and utilized on our local storage? So this is an activity we recognize can be limited, and we need to use it appropriately. It is temporary, because the next time we copy something, we replace the content that's already there. So we have to watch out for that and make sure that we don't overextend our usage of the temporary storage. Within Notepad, we're able to access a position, but it doesn't have to be a specific, fully identified position. We can create a position in our process by anchoring our identifier, our mouse, our click, and say, this is the beginning of our copy area. And that means it's relative. So we can copy a specific amount out of our target, or we can anchor and paste a specific amount relative to our anchor. We'll be using the anchor facility a little bit more in order to handle a dynamic set of content. So the anchor gives us where do we start either the copy or the paste activity, and that allows us to be more flexible in our data manipulation. The file and format is also a critical factor when we're working with the Notepad, so that we can look under our definitions and we can look under our tools. We're working within a file. We're working within a specific format content in order to identify whether we are using exact positioning or relative positioning. Now, within our application, we can select the edit information and the copy action. That allows us to gather the data that has been presented and put this into our clipboard. put it into the memory that is accessible to our bot, that's accessible to our other applications that are running. At that point, if we want to retain that information for a longer period of time, then we can assign the clipboard content to a variable. So in order to actually utilize this information, apply formatting rules, possibly access the data values in another step of our process, and permit that clipboard area to be reused, we're going to go through a process of determining where we are in our source material. Is it an absolute or a relative position? If it is relative, we need to have an anchor. We need to be able to identify the conditions for that particular piece of copy. Then we need to get the data from that source application. And by doing so, we put this data into a piece of memory that we call the clipboard. This clipboard can handle different elementary data types. Primarily, remember that the data that we are interfacing with at this point is character data. It comes with the representations, the formatting, the masking, the extra characters that make it human readable. So we may end up needing to do some manipulation of those values in order to make it an input to another area. And in order to do that manipulation, we have to assign it to a variable within our tool so that we can remove any extra formatting that isn't necessary, that would not be acceptable in our destination application, that would confuse it. So these are steps that are happening that you probably would recognize, but you may not have been aware of all of these additional changes in the data and the data representation. Just consider how a phone number can be represented, how a phone number for an international destination could be represented. Or think about different currencies. For example, the Japanese yen does not have a decimal place. European representations of currency use the comma where we use a decimal point. They use a period where we use a comma. So the formatting rules are different for different currencies. Formatting rules are different for phone numbers. How do we permit this to happen so that we can capture the data as it's displayed in a formatted means, extract the value that we may need, maybe reformat it for entry into the other application, and make sure that all of that data change occurs as if it were a human entering the data. So we're going through the notepad, we're figuring out how do I know what data to collect, what data to copy. Is it absolute or relative positioning? I get access to that value by copying it to the clipboard in memory, and then I can manipulate it as I put it into a variable that I can then utilize later in the process. So let's take a look here at file content. We're working not only with web pages, but we can be working with file content itself, working in spreadsheets, working in documents. How can we utilize our tool, our robotics process automation, to access data in a formatted presentation within an application, even more than the data within a web page? So let's think about the characteristics of a spreadsheet or of a document form, because we can start applying the document form rules when we start thinking about scanning and optical character recognition. The spreadsheet consists of a display that has embedded in it formatting rules. So do we capture the characters, the values that are there, or do we capture the equation behind the variables? If we are working with values that we see in one spreadsheet, and can we insert them into another spreadsheet that has embedded calculations and capture that result and use that result in another application? Within the document form, being able to provide information, being able to select a drop-down value, being able to look for a specific type of formatting, as we did with the web page and looking for a format called a header. Can we identify those constructs within the application that have a visible result, and can we then work with it? The answer, of course, is absolutely yes. So we're going to go through a process in the tool, and it is a flowchart activity. Why? Because we're working with more than just a sequence of steps within one application. So the flowchart activity allows us to address a more complex environment. We then need to activate the application itself. We're saying, okay, robotics process automation tool, access my spreadsheet or access my document. It utilizes the application that is resident. Much as we did with the browser, this is actually opening and utilizing the spreadsheet or document application that you identify. We then capture our data, or we specify the activity that allows us to position, allows us to insert values, allows us to establish our anchor point in order to perform the copy. Now we can establish the anchor point by actually issuing a find command or identifying from another variable the last piece of location where the data was presented. Or if we are appending to an open file, the tool is keeping track of the active point, the active anchor point in any open application within that scope. In order to finish this data capture, we have to implement the variables in the output property of our application. So we're identifying variables that contain information or data from within this application. We need to be careful with the scope here because we may need to extend the visibility of those variables beyond this one application. It may need to be within a flowchart scope or within something larger. Be cautious that for security purposes, you are maintaining the tightest feasible scope for the variables. Don't go overboard and make every variable a global variable. Keep it within that module that you're trying to do. Well, then what can we do with our applications that have opened up data files that are accessible to that application for that user privilege? Well, our spreadsheet controls allow us to work with individual elements, the cell itself. What values do we see? What can we write? But we can also perform activities over a data block, over a range of data, which fits in very nicely with our dynamically built data tables, because we may not know how many rows and columns are going to be copied. So this ties very nicely with our dynamic data tables. And here we are. We have the data table itself. We've put our variables out there as a data table for a range. We don't know going into the process in all cases how many rows we're actually going to need to collect. How big a data element do we have? How many paragraphs is it? How many sentences? How many bullet points? We know what the characteristic is, but we don't have an absolute predictor of the quantity. So we're going to put it into a data table. This allows us to define the structure and identify the variable name itself. So we've come through, we've done the data scraping, and our output to store the data not in the clipboard, but in an area within our control from the clipboard is going to be the data table. Then we're going to make that data available to another application. So we've done our definition, we've opened our data source, and we're going to collect the data through either absolute or dynamic positioning. And we're going to take that data from the clipboard and populate it into the data table. So we had to define the structure first and then make it available to the application that we are attaching so that we can open the application in the scope, open the data files, do the data collection or data scraping, which puts it in our clipboard, and populate the data table from the result. So now it is in our memory, and we'll be able to utilize that data in another action, which is to put it into an output file in an application. It doesn't have to be the same type of application. I can have data coming in from a spreadsheet and output it to a document. Our destination is going to need to have the positioning. Again, where is our anchor point? Is this a relative anchor point or is this an absolute? Are we always going to start at position A1 in our spreadsheet? Or is it relative? Find the first open, unpopulated cell in column A. And then we're going to format and position and put or paste the data that we have scraped into the output. So the content of the files then are being updated under our control. Now, if you want a quick way to see how this functions, certainly go in and do the steps while your tool is recording what's going on. Look carefully at this information. Remember your naming conventions, because you're going to want to apply modularity principles. How is this actually going to be repeatable, reusable in future assignments, in future projects? So knowing what you have available, knowing how to access it and find it again, is a very, very good habit to acquire at this point. As we're learning, as we're going through this material, start putting together all of these good habits so that when we start talking about testing, you're understanding that testing is not just using data that you know will work, but using data that you know will not work. Using data of different types that, according to the requirements, will work. When you're working in a user environment, formatting is a hidden requirement. How is the data presented to the user? What keystrokes, what techniques are necessary for the user to provide that data to the destination? So looking at this material, the process itself is fairly straightforward. And as always, if you get stuck, try to go through the exercise in the book. Try to record yourself going through those steps and come back and examine the results so that you're comfortable with what's happening and what you're seeing.